Hey guys, it's Casey and welcome back for another Unreal tutorial. So it's been a while, I think it's been 6 months since I made my last tutorial, and since then I've gotten a new computer, I've gotten a new mic, so my setup has completely changed. I'm using a different OBS. So my current mic, I think it might pick up more than it did before, I'm not too sure. So for the first few tutorials from being back, things might be a little bit weird, but we'll see how that goes. But for the tutorial, today what we're going to talk about is why we reuse code. I think I did a video a long time ago just briefly on this, but I want to kind of give some examples and why, because it's just something that always pops up where you just make a little mistake and it just steamrolls into suddenly you have so much more work to do because you just kind of got a little sloppy with your code. So the first example that we're going to go over is maybe you did something with buying something inside of your game. So for example, maybe we have a widget, and inside of our widget, it was the cost of a weapon. So I'm going to make a quick widget just as an example. I'm just going to throw in a text, and we're just going to say, press E to buy for, let's say, $100 or something like that. So that's good and dandy, and we would pop this up on the player screen when they went to buy something, right? But then maybe also when they went to actually physically buy it, so when they actually pressed E, maybe we ran some event and it was actually buying it, right? And then in our code for actually buying it, then what we would probably do is if we had a variable for the player's money, what we would do is we would just take this variable, and then if we were being sloppy with it, we would just be like, okay, minus 100 and set the player's money, and there we go, right? We're showing the player when they get near the item or when they highlight the item, hey, you can buy this for $100, and then when they actually go to buy it, we reduce their money by 100 and it's good to go, right? Like our code works, our functionality is there, but now what happens when we need to change the price of this item? Well, based on our current setup, we would need to go into our widget and change it to say 150, and then we would also have to remember to go into our code to where we're actually buying and change it to 150, and that maybe we also had a check on top of this of seeing if our money was actually like greater than equal to that 150, right? So you can see how something as simple as like, oh, what happens when we need to manipulate this code later? What happens when we need to manipulate these cost values? We're adding so much work, and oftentimes we're not changing these values later that day after we write this code. It might be 6 months down the line when we're like, oh, we need to rebalance our game, we need to change some of these values. If you have these values that are just lingering and they're not connected in any way in many different places, you're just shooting yourself in the foot and you're going to be adding so much work for yourself. So in reality, what really should have been done here is we should have linked this, in this case, we should have just linked this to some type of variable. Whether that was a data table and we had it held inside of a data table, whether it was an actor itself, like whether we just had an actor that was just visual for, let's say, the gun or the weapon, and inside that weapon we made a variable for its cost and we just set it there to be like 150 here, then if we just hooked it up here inside of our widget, and if we hooked it up inside of here, like if we just kind of did a fake cast to gun, we could get off our cost, right? And then we could just hook that up inside of our widget, inside of all these places, so that anytime we actually need to manipulate the cost, we just change it here and we're good. Everywhere where that cost was associated, whether it was checks inside of our code, whether it was displaying it inside of our widgets, it's all hooked up. And this is a very simple example of just by using a variable and hooking it up through variables, we save ourselves so much time. And it's a good habit to get into, in that because oftentimes in our game, it's not just one thing is buyable, right? We might have guns, we might have other weapons, or we might have a bunch of weapons, we might have like healing, ammo, grenades, upgrades, like whatever your game happens to be. So if we had all of those in like these really soft references, I'm not even sure if that's the right word for it, or not even references at all, where we're hard punching in numbers everywhere, anytime that you need to go back and balance things, think about the amount of work that it would be down the road to manipulate 100 items. If you're having to go in 3, 4, 5 different places to change these values, it's just you're adding so much work when simply you should have just done it from the get-go and made it simple on yourself. Now, the issue is oftentimes you don't really think about it when you're writing the code. When you're writing code, you're just zooming through and you're passing by. But then in reality, like the first time you hit a hiccup and you're like, wait, I need to alter that value, and you're finding yourself going to many places, it's probably like a good sign of, hey, I'm probably not doing this right. I should probably go back and figure out a way that I can actually variable this stuff, at least in this example. And the next example that we're going to talk about is maybe we're doing something with kind of the same idea of this, but maybe we should be more thinking in terms of function. So maybe our player has health, and maybe we manipulate their health in many ways. So maybe this isn't probably a good idea to show it like this, but maybe on tick we did like health regen, right? Maybe on tick we did, let's get our player's health and let's add 1 to it. Increment is the same thing as just adding 1 and setting it. I guess this way maybe is a bit more visual for beginners. And maybe we're doing this on tick, right? We're adding 1 to our health, but we don't just want to add 1 to our health. What we actually need to do is, because this needs to be capped, right? Maybe what we would end up writing, just to make it simpler as ourselves, is, hey, let's just clamp this, right? Let's just say, well, our minimum health is 0 and our maximum is 100. So no matter what, we'll never get out of that range, right? Or maybe you're doing a branch and you're saying, is our health less than 100? If yes, then add it to 1. However you want to do that. But in some way, if we were doing some type of health regen code, it might look like this. But then what if 2 months later, once again, because you're not always writing this code back to back, what if we wrote medkit code? So what if we had like a use medkit, and on this medkit, what we wanted to do is we wanted to maybe get our health and add 50 to it, right? So maybe we wrote our code and we're like, oh yeah, let's add 50 to it. And then, all right, so we need to make sure it doesn't go over 100. So let's clamp it from 0 to 100. And now let's set our health, right? But once again, what happens down the road, you're like, oh, we have a really cool idea for a game. What if we allow the player to upgrade their maximum health? Well, now you need to be like, crap. Now, where's all the places that you had this reference for 100, and now you're having to go in all these places, and now, once again, you're having to change to like, oh, now it's 125. Find the next place. Oh, it's 125. And you can see how this could be problemsome, just like the widget, or the cost example before with money. But here, it's like we could make a variable and make a variable for our max health if we wanted to. That is one way to do it. Another way of doing it is, I guess you would do it this way with a variable if you wanted it to be manipulated at runtime, if you wanted the player to be able to do things at runtime. But maybe, just for example's sake, maybe this was just internally before release we wanted to alter this stuff. The better idea might be to make a function and make this function just change health or something of that sort. And what we could do with this function is we could get our current health, and that we could add to it, and an input into this, an integer, and we could just say change by, like change our health by, what value are we changing our health by, and now we clamp it, and we could do our 0 to 100, and now we can set our health. And then what we could do here is now, using this way, this, once again, this is just an example. I'm not saying this is the right way of doing health, but I'm just saying as an example. So now what we could do is, instead of doing this event tick and doing it like this, we could do change health. We could delete that, and we could just change our health by 1. And now our regen code is the exact same as it was before. And if we go to our medkit code, we could do the same thing here. We could delete out our code, drop in our function, and just say change our health by 50. And now our code is exactly the same. But now let's say 2 months down the line, whatever it is, maybe you have health changeable by spells, by medkits, by potions, by regen, by other players healing you, whatever it happens to be. Now maybe down the road we're like, man, our game would really be a lot more balanced if, say, our health was out of 150, or our max health was at 150. Now all of a sudden, hey, we changed our clamp one time, and now it affected all of the places that we were manipulating our health, right? So this is just an example of it. It doesn't have to be necessarily that we are using a like a variable here, or a global variable of max health to manipulate our health, but now we're just changing something inside of something like a clamp. So that's a way that we could maybe use a function to reuse code, so that later when we come back, we're not scrambling to find all the places that we touched that code. This happens a lot. This happens several times when you're making a game, because once again, it's not at the time. It's not a week after you write the code, it's months after you write the code where you start to run into these issues. And the key is that when you find yourself running into these situations, change it immediately. Don't put it off, and don't be like, oh, well, I already did it like 10 times this way. I'm just going to change the values and just not worry about it. You're probably going to have to do it again later. Just make the changes now, do it clean, do it right, and that you'll save yourself so much time in the future. So for the last example, what we're going to talk about is maybe you did something with like UI. So maybe you had some type of like warning pop up into your game, or some notification of a widget. And maybe you had a widget pop up and it said like, warning, enemies incoming, or something of the sort, right? Or maybe it was like an objective changed, or something of that sort, right? But maybe when we popped up these widgets, we wanted to play audio. So a kind of a bad way of doing it would probably be like if we did like pop-up warning 1. And with this pop-up warning 1, we created our widget, and after we created our widget, we did stuff like play sound. And that with this play sound, we did like, we don't have any sound files here, but maybe with this sound file, it was like a warning beep. And we did this in a lot of places. So later on, when we had some other UI pop up that used the same stuff, we did it here, and like we copy pasted the code, and maybe somewhere else we copy pasted the code, and we copy pasted the code. Well, what happens now when we're like, man, down the road, we really don't like this beeping noise? Now, if we want to change this beeping noise for when these warnings pop up, we would really have to go back and start changing, finding like every place that we reference this beep. We're like, man, where were all the places we changed the beep? So now we have to come back, and now we have to change it to beep 2, find the next one, change it to beep 2, right? Like once again, this is a situation where maybe we could do this better. Maybe we could do this cleaner. It could be anything from just adding a function of just like our UI beep, or like our UI warning beep, and that we could just, instead of it being here, we put it inside of here. And that now when we do this, instead of putting it after our widgets of the actual playing of the sound file, we're just calling our function. And that once again, if we wanted to change what our UI warning beep was, we just go inside the function and change it once to whatever value we wanted. And now all the places that we were playing that warning beep, it's going through the function, it's good to go. The other solution might be that, well, if we're playing the same kind of warning, if we're probably reusing maybe the same widget animations, and maybe we're playing the same audio for the widgets, why are we using so many places? Like, this is maybe a little bit more in depth, but why are we using so much of the same kind of copy pasted code to create these widgets? Like, this is as like a deeper example, and this is more specific to widgets. Maybe the better thing to do was, on our widget, create a variable, and this is like the actual text of our widget, and we could make this a text variable, make it instance editable, expose on spawn, which if you see what happens here, if we make it instance editable and expose on spawn, this is our cost weapon widget. If we make it our cost weapon widget, you can see here, we have our actual text. So instead of maybe having all these warnings where we just kind of duplicated widgets just to have different text inside these warnings, maybe we should have just had one warning widget, which here it's just called cost weapon, and maybe here we could have done warning enemies behind. And that in our next warning, instead of doing all this, maybe we reuse this code here, right? And we could do different things here. Like, I'm just trying to go to show how we could maybe reuse the same widgets even, instead of copy pasting like our cost weapon widget over and over to have different text inside of it. But once again, I'm going a bit deeper, but that just goes to show that there's so many different ways that we can reuse our code, whether it's promoting variables so that, like with our cost, it's not in 8 different places, so that when we need to change the cost, we're fumbling to find all the places we referenced it. Or maybe it's like with our changing of the health, maybe it's something as simple as like a clamp, something we are not normally thinking like, oh, I need to promote what we're clamping these values by some type of variable so that we can change it later. It just, sometimes it just slips your mind, and you find yourself like, man, I really wish I just functioned that, and just, instead of manipulating our health in so many different places where we're doing the add to it and we're setting it over and over, maybe we should just make that one function. And this doesn't really apply to C++ because if you're writing C++, you're doing it like this anyways. But with blueprints, it's really nice with blueprints because they give us so much functionality and they allow us to get away with a lot with blueprints. But at the same time, by being able to get away with a lot with blueprints, it really opens you up to being pretty sloppy. So that's just a side note. And our last example was just something as simple as reusing the same audio. If you find yourself copy pasting a lot, like I said in the previous video about this stuff where I didn't really give examples, it's probably a mistake. So here's just some examples, some reasons of why we reuse code. Inevitably, when you're making a game, it's like always, it's months down the road that you run into issues, not at the time. We need to do our best to think ahead and kind of plan ahead, but we don't. But when we run into those issues, we go back and we fix them and we make it so our code is reusable. So that's it for this tutorial, and I'll see you guys in the next video.